Greetings, travelers. It is with huge excitement that I say today's video is actually a collaborative effort with my friend Imperial Knowledge, where we took turns describing the life and reign of all 22 Septim Emperors. And if you haven't seen part 1 where we talked about the first 11, head on over to Imperial Knowledge's channel to get caught up before you start this one. I probably got something in the top one of these corners of the screen where you can go to his video first. And finally, if you're here from Imperial Knowledge's channel, hi, my name's ItsTimebomb. I talk about lore and Skyrim quests on this channel, but my content is a little less studious and a little more fueled by lines of moon sugar. The cleric said the herb should make you go away. Get out of my head! Does this answer your question?
Time to play the game!
So with introductions out of the way, let's get started with the absolutely legendary Pelagius III, the Mad Emperor.
I'm a psycho.
Now, I'm glad we're starting with Pelagius III because not only is he my personal favorite emperor, but I will be reading from a book in Skyrim dedicated to the legend himself titled The Madness of Pelagius by let's just call him Tim. So that means everything I'm about to read to you is absolutely confirmed canon. Thor's Pelagius Septim was born a prince of the Wayrest royal family in 3E119, and the coming years after Emperor Antiochus's death were peaceful and friendly as his favorite brother Magnus had taken his place upon the Ruby Throne. Is that right? Hold on a sec. Okay, yeah, that's right. Let's continue. It's been long debated where Pelagius first started showing signs of what would soon turn into full-blown madness. Many believe that the war on the Red Diamond raging in the background of his childhood could have partially had something to do with it. Growing tired of the war raging right at their doorstep in Wayrest, Pelagius, his siblings, and his mother Euthila fled to a remote island known as Balfiera, where their home can still be found to this day. It is here on this island where much of Pelagius's childhood would be documented, with the nurses and other visitors describing him as a, quote, handsome, personable boy who was interested in magic, music, and sport. Though he wasn't always known to tell the truth, many believed that Pelagius Septim III would be just what the Empire needed in the coming years, with a seemingly endless civil war raging in the background. He officially started his noble journey when, after Sepphoris Septim I finally brought the War of the Red Diamond to an end and appointed Pelagius as the King of Solitude, where people would quickly notice his unusual behaviors. I don't care that I fucked up the last word. We're gonna run it. Including what were described as alarming shifts in his weight, with an account of a diplomat from Ebonheart calling Pelagius a hale and hearty soul with a heart so big it widens his waist. Just 5 months after that, the Princess of Firsthold wrote to her brother after meeting Pelagius, quote, "The king gripped my hand and it felt like I was being clutched by a skeleton." Pelagius had gone from alarmingly overweight to severely malnourished in just 5 months. And after Emperor Sepphoris fell from his horse and died just 3 years after the Siege of Solitude, having no children of his own to carry on the legacy, Pelagius's now elderly father Magnus stepped down from the throne of Wayrest and took his seat at the Ruby Throne for just 5 short years, all the while the people of Tamriel knew the eccentric and unpredictable Pelagius III was next in line. There isn't many instances of Pelagius's antics being documented during his reign as King of Solitude, but there are a couple. One case where he held the young princes and princesses of Sylvanar in his room with him, declaring he would only release them after an unsigned declaration of war was slipped under his door. Another case where he ripped off all his clothes during a speech he was giving at a local Solitude festival, which had caused his advisors to keep a closer eye on him. And other than that, it is just widely believed that any other gaps that need filling in this timeline are promised to be pretty much nothing more than just nonsensical antics that Pelagius got up to. But one of the most notable things that turned his public image for the worse was when, by the order of Emperor Magnus, Pelagius was married to a, quote, beautiful heiress of an ancient dark elf noble family, his new wife, Kataraya Ra'athim. And if you're not very familiar with Nordic history, they don't really love it when their kin marries a dark elf, much less the king of one of the most powerful holds in Skyrim. But that didn't matter to Magnus because he just wanted to strengthen relations between the Empire and the Ebonheart Pact. Who cares what people already think of an infamously mad king, right? Not too long after, on the 8th of 2nd Seed, 3E145, after a long and diplomatic life, Emperor Magnus passed away peacefully in his sleep, and that led to a pivotal moment in the empire. As Pelagius was next in line for the Ruby Throne, his sister I don't know how to say that name, I'm sorry, I give up. Polethe was crowned King of Solitude, and both Pelagius and Kataraya rode to the Imperial City for possibly the most negatively received coronation the Empire had seen so far. It was also stated that Pelagius fainted the moment the Imperial crown was placed upon his head, but Kataraya had held him up, and only those close enough to catch the small details were able to notice, though this story has not yet been verified. And now we're in the final stretch of Pelagius III's story. The rest probably aren't going to be this long, so thanks for being patient. As the Emperor, Pelagius never truly ruled the Empire. His wife and Empress Kataraya, along with the Elder Council, called all the shots, with a secondary mission of making sure Pelagius didn't make a mockery of the Empire. One of these embarrassing events being when an Argonian ambassador representing the city of Blackrose came to court for a meeting. Pelagius insisted upon taking his best attempt at communicating with only grunts and squeaks, as that is how the Argonians spoke in their native tongue. To make matters even more strained, Pelagius III was obsessed with cleanliness, and there are many stories of guests in the Imperial Palace waking up to the sounds of early morning deep cleaning. And in one infamous case, while inspecting the work of his servants, Pelagius took a shit on the floor just to give them something else to clean up. Reminder, this is the leader of a unified Tamriel we're talking about. Soon after he put his chocolate starfish on the palace floor, he upgraded to actually biting and attacking visitors of the Imperial Palace, which forced the Elder Council's hand to send Pelagius to a private asylum just 2 years after he took the throne, and Kataraya was anointed as a substitute in Pelagius's absence. Conspiracies had started circulating throughout Tamriel, from terrible experiments being performed on Pelagius to rumors of infidelity, as Kataraya had become pregnant after Pelagius was locked away. And finally, on what was described as a warm night in Sun's Dawn, at 34 years old, Thor's Pelagius Septim III died in his cell in the Temple of Kinnereth due to a fever. Emperor Pelagius III holds a special place in my heart. Starring in one of my favorite Skyrim quests of all time, The Mind of Madness, he was a man that would go down in Imperial history as one of the least desirable emperors, and at the same time, one of the most famous ones, having his own holiday dedicated to him. The second of Sun's Dawn, which is uncertain whether it's actually Pelagius's true death date or not, is celebrated as a holiday called Mad Pelagius, a day where all sorts of foolishness is encouraged. And that, my friends, is the story of Pelagius III, the Mad Emperor, and it is now with great excitement and honor that I pass you on to my friend Imperial Knowledge for Kataraya's Imperial reign.
And now it only hurts when you touch it.
Touch. Do I have to follow you all day?
So next up, Kataraya Septim, or rather Kataraya Ra'atim. She was the first and only confirmed Dunmer Empress of the Septim Empire. While many in the Imperial Court and within the Other Council opposed her position as Empress due to her being a Dunmer, and due to her cultural heritage as a Dunmer, her crowning seems to have been a quite straightforward affair, as she'd already practically been secretly running the Empire as Empress Regent, when her husband Pelagius the Mad had descended so far into madness that the Imperial elite was forced to secretly put him in an asylum, while his wife Kataraya ruled in his stead. Now, despite the opposition against her at court, she was a calm, steady and wise ruler who often chose the diplomatic way out and did not make any rash decisions on a whim, unlike her husband. Which is coincidentally also why the marriage between her and Pelagius III had been arranged in the first place, as it were these qualities, among other nice things like an alliance in Morrowind, that Magnus Septim had her marry his son, who would later become Pelagius the Mad. And once married, she was often the one making decisions while trying to keep Pelagius from embarrassing himself. So all in all, despite the opposition at court, it was a relatively smooth transition to solidify her position as Empress over the Empire once her husband had passed away, since she already de facto had held the opposition for 2 years. Still, her troublesome relationship with the Other Council and Imperial Court did give her quite a distaste of the Imperial City itself, meaning that she often ended up traveling far and wide within the Empire, using her diplomatic skills to repair and mend many of the political relations that were broken by her husband during his reign, and help restore much of the damage of the War of the Red Diamond, which was still visible in many places across the Empire. This made her actually a very much beloved empress by most of the people and most of the local nobility, which in the end cemented her reign in history as one of the most prosperous of the Septim Dynasty. However, despite this adoration by the public and by local nobles, at the very heart of the empire cracks started to appear, as in her absence from the city, the Elder Council managed to gain more and more political power. And not just that, there was also discontent about her son Cassinder, who many claimed might not have even been a true child of Pelagius Septim III, as Cassinder Septim was allegedly born out of a visit by Catariah to Pelagius' asylum. Catariah always claimed that the child was his, however, seemingly she had no other proof except her word, meaning that many of the nobles at court kept doubting his legitimacy in the end, and claimed that the true Septim line ended with Catariah, as without a blood relation to Pelagius Septim III, if Cassinder was indeed illegitimate, Cassinder would not have had a blood relation to Tiber Septim, but I suppose we will never know the true story behind that one. It didn't make the situation any better though that she also remarried after a few years, and not to a Septim or an Imperial, but to a Breton noble named Galivir Lariat, who she also had a son with, who officially entered the line of succession of the empire, and of him it was openly known that he was no true Septim, even though it's been claimed that the Lariat family was sort of distantly related to the Septim Dynasty, but that wasn't enough to really convince the Elder Council. So yeah, bottom line on the rule is that she was a much beloved ruler by the people over the course of her long, more than 40-year-long reign. But she was heavily disliked at court and within the Elder Council, who grabbed power for themselves while she was traveling out and about, and not in the Imperial city.
I don't feel so good.
Cassinder Septim is another one of those emperors that only has about 2 sentences of lore, so that's a bit of a shame. Born to his father, the Mad Emperor Pelagius, and his mother Catariah, who ruled for several decades after his father was locked away, Cassinder had a seemingly average Septim childhood. After at some point becoming the king of Wayrest by 3E193, he turned over his throne due to poor health and appointed his younger half-brother Uriel Lariat, who he had legally adopted. 7 years later, after his mother Catariah had met her ill-fated death in the Bog of the Black Marsh, Cassinder had taken her place at the Ruby Throne, even though he was still plagued with sickness. The Elder Council was seemingly hesitant for Cassinder to be crowned emperor, as there still seemed to be drama brewing with the fact that he was born as half Breton, half Dunmer. These opinions held no weight though, as he was the only blood relative of Pelagius III, and because of that, the only remaining blood relative of Tiber Septim. His reign as emperor was short, dying only 2 years after his coronation. With no children to take his place at the throne, Uriel Septim IV took the throne, and the only mark Cassinder seemed to have made on the world was allegedly a haunted fort near the town of Wayrest being named after him. So you did that. That's pretty cool. Next emperor.
Hey, you know who lives in this house? A great big phony!
So, with the death of Cassinder Septim, we now get to Uriel Septim IV, except one could say, and I will say, that he wasn't a real Septim at all. After all, like we talked about in the bit on his mother, Catariah, who wasn't a blood relative of Tiber Septim, she remarried after the death of Pelagius the Mad to a Breton noble, and Uriel IV was the child of their union, a Dunmer empress with no blood relations to Tiber Septim, and a Breton noble without a really clear or strong blood relation to Tiber Septim. So weak was their relation that many in court doubted whether the relation was there at all. Now, why do I stress this fact? Because it's super interesting, as it implies that the theory about a dragon-born emperor being blessed by Akatosh upon their crowning instead of it being a hereditary blood gift might be true, as there's no evidence of the dragon fires being unlit during his reign, or that of his mother Catariah, who, remember, was a Dunmer and not an Imperial Septim, meaning that Uriel IV, who kept himself on the throne for over 40 years, might have actually gained the blessing of Akatosh, which we call being dragonborn, somehow at his coronation. Which is super interesting, as his reign is one of the strongest arguments that I have seen for the theory that the Septims were never really dragonborns in the shouting and soul of dragon sense, at least after Tiber Septim died, and that they were just blessed by Akatosh to continue what Tiber Septim started. Unless that tiny sliver of Septim blood that came through his father, who was a super distantly related cousin to the Septim line, was enough to make him a dragonborn, but then that still doesn't really explain why the dragon fires remained lit under his mother Catariah. But all of that goes into a far deeper discussion on what it actually means to be dragonborn, and whether or not there are differences between the Septim line and someone like the last dragonborn in Skyrim, for example, who can actually shout and has the so-called soul of a dragon, and it kind of strays from the subject. So for now, let's talk about Uriel Septim IV's reign instead. And even that reign was very much defined by who his parents were, or rather who they were not, as the Imperial nobility, who'd grabbed even more power during the period of Cassinder's reign, made his life difficult at every step, never letting him forget he wasn't a true Septim, meaning that there were plots against him everywhere and civil unrest in the Empire. But he survived all this, and he kept his ass firmly on the Ruby Throne for over 40 years, becoming known as someone of strong conviction and strong will, despite being at constant strife with the Elder Council, who he had to vie over power with at basically every turn and politically fight tooth and nail, meaning that he was never able to implement any real change in the Empire, but still I can respect him for holding them off for such a long time. Unfortunately for him, when he ultimately died, the Elder Council immediately disinherited his son Andorak Septim, stripping him of the possibility of ever becoming the new emperor, instead selecting a cousin of Uriel IV, who supposedly had a far stronger blood tie to Tiber Septim.
Why am I still getting hate?
Sepphoris Septim II didn't have much information on his life before he took the Ruby Throne, other than a brief mentioning that he was a king of an unspecified kingdom. After his cousin Emperor Uriel IV died, his son Andorak would have been the next emperor, but the Elder Council crowned Sepphoris Septim II as the next emperor due to the fact that he is more closely related to the Septim bloodline. His reign would be met with much more backlash than it would peace, because Sepphoris was the first emperor in the Septim Dynasty who was neither a Breton nor had he spent any of his childhood in High Rock. This man was 100% Nord from the mountains of Skyrim, where most of his political interests lie, along with Morrowind. He was a polar opposite of Emperor Uriel IV before him, and for this reason pretty much all of High Rock detested his reign. And the main conflict he would face during his reign as emperor was a rebellion started in the name of none other than Andorak, the man whose chance on the Ruby Throne was stolen from him in the name of preserving the Septim bloodline. While he was fighting off that rebellion, a man named Haemon Cameron, also known as the Cameron Usurper, had started another war in western Tamriel where, with his army of Bosmer mercenaries, Daedra, and undead, he would quickly conquer Valenwood. His army then marched to Cyrodiil, where they absolutely slaughtered the city of Kvatch, and after defeating both armies from the city of Tanith and Rihad at the Battle of Dragontooth, he had managed to conquer all of Hammerfell as well. At this point, Sepphoris II had deployed several troops of mercenaries into Hammerfell in order to stop this rebellion, but if the soldiers couldn't be bribed by the rebellion, they were killed and then reanimated to fight alongside them. Naval and land battles between the Empire and Andorak's rebellion would continue until finally in 3E256, the Elder Council granted him the kingdom of Shornhelm, which ended the rebellion so that Sepphoris could focus on the bigger fish to fry. By 3E266, word of the usurper's reign of terror had reached High Rock, and after a long year of politics and arguing, they were ready to begin repelling the invasion. Many of the leaders in High Rock finally united under Othrock, the Baron of Dwynnon, and in 3E267, they finally slayed Haemon Cameron on the battlefield of Firewaves with little assistance from Emperor Sepphoris. Of course, people didn't really like that the Empire didn't do shit to help High Rock during his campaign, so that made people hate Sepphoris even more. And even decades after his reign came to an end in 3E268, to which the Ruby Throne was passed down to his son Uriel Septim V, there was still decades of rebellion and civil wars to come in the wake of Sepphoris Septim II's negligence. Uriel Septim V took the Ruby Throne in 3E268 after his father Sepphoris left the Empire in a bit of a pickle. At this point in history, there was civil wars and rebellion raging throughout all of Tamriel, and it was Uriel's job to fix it. Soon after coronation, Uriel began prepping for several invasions as his army made their way to Akavir, which seemed to be the main target on his warpath. Starting in 3E268, the Imperial army successfully invaded and conquered the island of Roscria, which would remain in the Empire's control until power was handed over to the Kingdom of Solitude. 5 years down the road, the Imperial army would invade Cathnaquay. I'm really trying with these names, I'm sorry. Another 4 years goes by until they invaded Aneslia. Another 3 years passes before they invaded the island of Ezronia, which would remain in the Empire's grip for 2 years before the leader of the island, Prince Bashamon, finally surrendered the whole kingdom to Uriel, who would in turn build it into a base for the Imperial Navy and eventually use it as a launching point for their invasion in Akavir. And finally, 4 years later, in 3E288, The invasion of Akavir would take place and become a major catastrophic failure for the Empire, where Emperor Uriel Septim V reportedly died on the battlefield of Lonith. Despite this failure, Uriel V is recognized as not just a military genius, but one of the greatest emperors to ever ride into battle, second to only the legendary Tiber Septim, leaving behind his wife Thonica, who would come to be a substitute for the emperor until his son Uriel Septim VI reached adulthood in order to claim the Ruby Throne, and his two daughters Eloisa and Morihatha.
Listen, Linda. Listen.
Uriel Septim VI was born in 3E 285 just after his father departed for what would be his final invasion on Akavir. Being too young to rule the nation at the time, his mother Thonica would take his place with limited power, while the Elder Council ultimately made the final decisions on just about everything. But the Elder Council took this opportunity of undisputed power and ran with it, as they would refuse to give Uriel VI full control over the Empire until 3E 307 at 22 years old. From childhood, he had slowly been taking responsibility as he worked his way up to maturity, despite the Elder Council and even his own mother enjoying their power too much to willingly pass it on to the next Septim son. And by the time he took his place at the Ruby Throne, the way the government was ran now gave him little power as emperor, besides the ability to veto the Elder Council's decisions. By 3E 313, he could finally say that he truly did reign over Tamriel, where he would do just a few notable things as emperor. He had traveled to Linpan March, where with his half-sister Morihatha he would encounter King Deadwolf Deer, a wood elf that had been transformed into a monster described with characteristics of wolf, deer, and crocodile traits. There was also a little bit of information stated that during this encounter, Deadwolf Deer would kill all of their royal escorts, but somehow Uriel and Morihatha both survived. Uriel would also come to use troops of guards and defunct spy networks to persuade and possibly blackmail the more difficult Elder Council members. Around this time, Morihatha would become his best ally after marrying Ulfi Gerson, the wealthy and influential Baron of Winterhold. And then things were just kind of chill until 3E 313, where just like his forefather Sepphoris Septim I, Emperor Uriel Septim VI would fall from his horse and succumb to his injuries despite the hard work of the best healers the Empire had to offer. And after a considerably boring reign as emperor compared to his forefathers, with no children to speak of, the Ruby Throne was passed on to Uriel's half-sister Morihatha Septim.
After the death of Uriel VI, one of his sisters took the throne, Morihatha Septim, who was one of a pair of twins together with Eloisa Septim. She and her twin sister Eloisa had been the biggest allies of her brother at court, and after he fell from his horse and died, Morihatha, being one of his strongest allies in his fight to gain back power from the Elder Council, was able to take the throne and finish the job in her brother's fight against the Elder Council. Under Morihatha, power was once more concentrated at the level of the Empress, and she was, for all terms and purposes, the most powerful ruler of the last century during her reign in terms of political power at least. And to history she became known as the first of a series of very capable rulers over the Empire in its latter years, as she quelled rebellions and was a wise and cautious ruler who picked her battles carefully, and who according to many was the most beautiful empress since Alessia herself, although that may have been flattery. Unfortunately, her death would come early as she was assassinated, most likely by an Argonian ruler that she refused to help out as the battle seemed far too risky that he asked her help on, although that nobleman would ultimately always continue to claim that he was innocent and that he did not order her assassination, so who knows. Now, unfortunately, Morihatha had no living children at the time of her death, and her sister Eloisa, final child of Emperor Uriel V, had died several years earlier. So with no direct apparent heir, the son of her sister Eloisa, who had been born several years before her sister's death, was appointed heir and succeeded his aunt as emperor. And that son of Eloisa, Emperor Pelagius Septim IV, would be the father of the first of these emperors that we've actually seen in person in any of the games, Emperor Uriel Septim VII. However, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as Pelagius IV was his own man, who proved to be a very capable ruler, just like his aunt, as he continued to retake many rebellious kingdoms and dispel political unrest all across Tamriel. While he was less successful than his aunt, as all the low-hanging fruit, the easy rebellions, had already been quelled, and as such he had a far tougher time than his aunt, still it's said that he made a lot of progress, and the history of the Empire books can be quoted on saying that the Empire, after his more than 50-year reign ended and his son came to power, was closer to full unification than it had been for 300 years.
You have just shit your pants. I can smell it from all the way over here.
We all know.
Most likely the first emperor you've ever heard of if you started your journey through the Elder Scrolls with Oblivion, Uriel Septim VII, born in 3E 346, was an interesting child. One notable story that while Queen Berenziah and Prime Minister Symmachus were at dinner with the Septim family, the young Uriel would insist that a seat on the table be reserved for his imaginary female friend named Justin, and while he would grow out of this phase, it would spawn a long-running joke between Symmachus and Uriel during his reign as emperor. As Symmachus would visit during Uriel's reign, he would ask how Justin was doing, to which he would often humor him with an actual answer. One specific account stating that Uriel told a whole story of how Justin had ran off with a rough around the edges Khajiit that she would marry and settle down with in Lilandril, where they would grow fire ferns and mugwort. To my surprise, there actually isn't much information on Uriel VII's reign as emperor besides tales that due to his hard work, Tamriel was closer to being united as one than it had been since Uriel I's reign. The most notable thing to happen during his reign, and possibly the whole Septim Dynasty, is when his own Imperial battle mage Jaeger Tharn would betray and imprison Uriel VII in a plane of oblivion and use an elusive spell that would transform him into Uriel's likeness, where he would reign for 10 years as an imposter among us. Jaeger specifically put Uriel in a plane of oblivion where time would pass exponentially slower because the amulet of kings he wears would notify the Elder Council upon his death. It is unclear what exactly Jaeger's motives were for impersonating Uriel for 10 years, besides probably just wanting to see what it's like to be the emperor. Either way, it's written that in 3E 433, a man simply known as the Eternal Champion would slay Jaeger Tharn and free Uriel VII from his plane of oblivion. After his return, Uriel would work hard to continue his mission of reuniting Tamriel, but after 10 years of Jaeger's nonsense, the momentum for this goal was slowed down a significant amount. Though in the coming years, things appeared to be getting better, and there was hope that things could possibly return to the golden age of Tiber Septim's reign once again. This man had been through a lot during his reign as emperor, on top of a lifetime of prophetic visions that included his assassination and the start of the Oblivion Crisis that would take place after his death. Uriel Septim VII was ultimately assassinated on the 27th of last seed in 3E 433 by the mythic Dawn, and the only person who could take his place as emperor was his illegitimate son Martin Septim.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
Martin Septim had it pretty rough, to be honest. He was the final Septim Emperor who would watch pretty much everyone he loved die and bear witness to the horror that was the Oblivion Crisis. As an infant, Martin had been stolen by the Grand Master of the Blades, Joffrey, where he would grow up knowing nothing of his true origins or parents. As a young man, Martin was an apprentice of the Mages Guild, where he would quickly grow impatient with the rules and regulations of their craft. He would soon throw caution to the wind as he and his peers begun worshipping Sanguine in order to learn about Daedric magic, and for a brief period in time he was actually in possession of the fabled Sanguine Rose. His interest in Daedric practices would come to an end when, as it is written in the text, tragedy struck in his life that led to the death of several of his friends, which he blames himself for consorting with the Daedra in the first place. It was from that point on that he had renounced all things involving Daedra, rededicated himself to the Nine Divines, and became a priest of Akatosh in the city of Kavach. And that's when shit started hitting the fan, because in the history books, that was soon followed by Martin bearing witness to his father and half-brothers being assassinated by the mythic Dawn just before the Oblivion Crisis broke out. Knowing that he was likely next as the last and final Septim family member, the Blades would keep Martin safe and hiding until the end of the crisis, where Martin would pay the ultimate price to save the people of a now crumbled empire that his forefathers had fought and died to build. At the final horizon of the empire, with annihilation of the mortal plane on the threshold, Martin Septim, the final Septim, with the help of an unknown hero, would sacrifice his own life in order to embody the all-powerful Akatosh, who would cast Mehrunes Dagon back into oblivion, which would in turn end the Oblivion Crisis, and Tamriel was in absolute shambles. but there was still hope for the future. I want to say thank you all so much for making it this far in the video. Not only was this specific project a huge amount of work, but it's honestly such an honor to work with Imperial knowledge and a privilege to call him my friend. If you're new here and want more of whatever it is I've got going on, there's a whole bunch for you to check out and a whole bunch more on the way. Give me a
King in the castle, king in the castle.
in the comments so I know you made it this far. Watch this, guys. Tell someone you love them. Thank you all so much for the time you've given me, and I hope to see you again real soon.